Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, I have with me Carlos Soares. He is, until recently anyway, the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Diageo and previously held senior data leadership positions at Nike, Liberty Global, TalkTalk, Vodafone, and a bunch of other places. Really pleased to have him on the show. And we're talking about value-charged analytics transformation, which is a topic very close to my heart. Carlos, I welcome you to the show. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks, Jason. Really good to meet you and good to be on the show. Yes.
Great. So, yeah, let's talk about you for a sec. So, Chief Data Officer, senior leadership positions at a bunch of places. How's that been? What's your experience in sort of the data leadership space?
Yeah, I think interesting times we're in. I think it's been like that for probably the last decade, and it just gets better and better as we've gone along, right? I think the roles that I've been in, I've had the privilege of working for some of the best brands on the planet. So I think that's always really exciting. And my roles have always really been, when I've come into those organizations, is how do we actually transform and drive change within the organization? I am always surprised just by the level of maturity of companies as you come in. You always expect them to be further, but they're not. But that's the role I enjoy. I come in, I fix what's broken, if you like, and we build up that capability. And it's been super exciting, right? Great people in those companies, really motivated, collaboration happening in them. So yeah, always very exciting. And I get the energy from the people in the company as much as the brand. And so those transformations really create a buzz within me as we go about to affect that change. So yeah, super exciting to be part of those roles.
Awesome. Has it always been about transformation?
No, it hasn't. I think when I initially started out, it wasn't necessarily transformation. It was just trying to figure out how to do this analytics thing.
Yeah.
And it was early days. I mean, I got into the business of analytics, if you like, back in the 90s when I was creating churn models for a retailer. And we were just trying to work out how to keep customers. It was as simple as that. But I got bitten by the bug, and I started to do analytics, and then moved out into leadership positions. And some of the companies I've joined in the past, like when I joined Centrica, they had an analytics team. They started with some of those capabilities. TalkTalk already had a unit. But there's always an element of transformation. You can't go into such a fast-moving industry and just be cranking the handle. It is always about transforming and improving. So while it's not always the primary, there is always an element of transformation.
Underlying
Of course. Yeah, of course. Because if you're not doing it, you're not staying ahead of the competition. You're not ahead of the game, and you'll soon become stale. So it has to be about transforming.
Yeah. And at the top, I talked about that we're going to sort of explore this idea of value-charged analytics transformation. Yeah. What do you mean by that? Because I talk a lot about focusing on value and not just building capability, and I sort of feel that we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what do you mean by value charged analytics?
For me, what it means is it needs to have an actionability to the analytics to drive the value for the organization. And I always think of, there's two things we're doing in the really black and white way: shareholder value and driving revenue for the organization. It's as simple as that, right? And so analytics can't be going, hey, let's go and build this sexy looking algorithm and let's think about pie in the sky analytics. It has to have value driving that in the organization. And that's why I think it's always really risky. We always think so far forward, nobody else is there with us, and it's going to be something that massively transforms the business. Yeah. And we forget about those little initiatives we need to do to get that consistent value across the business. So it has to be relevant. And for me, that relevance is the pounds and pence is one. And two is people actually feel engaged, understand it, and go, hang on a second, I can do my job better because I'm using this. So that's what I mean by value charge, really driving that and thinking about what is the business question? What is the problem I need to resolve? And then helping the organization resolve that. That's the focus, and that's where it needs to be.
Yeah. Have you got some examples of that kind of actionable value? Because I think it's about delivering. I think what you're saying there is about sort of delivering on some outcomes, about achieving the success that the organization is trying to get to. But I don't know, maybe some of the organizations you've worked with, what are some of those actionable focus points that you've been working on?
Yeah, I think for me, there's one that's always been like a common thread of something I've had to do in almost every organization, and it's not the sexiest thing to do. And that is really looking at the reporting capability across the organization and setting out how we're performing as a business. Now, that sounds really simple.
Yeah.
The problem is in such a complex world, what most people end up doing is finance does their reporting, marketing does their reporting, supply does their reporting, and they never ever connect. So the first thing I always look at is how can we just connect the organization so we're not only understanding what drives what revenue is and how we're doing, but how is that connected? And so one of the elements, for example, we were doing in a previous company, and it was with Liberty Global, when you were looking at the sales and the revenue being down, the supposition was that the issue was that we were churning customers. And the issue or the driver was not that we were churning customers. The root cause was that the network wasn't good enough. And therefore, customers were churning because they weren't getting that. And we got that from this driver-based performance management. So looking at those reports, through KPI trees, that was a way of delivering quick value, showing the business how we're all connected, and then driving it from that. But that's one of those where I think it's that core fundamental piece. You just have to do it, right? Yeah. And kind of the second component of that was what we discovered as we went on this journey is, Liberty Global's got multiple operating companies throughout Europe. It had 14 at that stage, and then they had Latin America and cable and wireless in the Caribbean, all these companies. What we soon discovered is when you looked at churn, for example, we had 13 definitions. When you looked at sales revenues, there were 7 or 8 different definitions. So the other piece we went about was to get that foundation was that data governance component, the definitions, getting that in place. And we only looked at our level 1 and level 2 KPIs, the very top KPIs of the business, revenue, and then volume and value, churn, acquisition, those very simplistic top 100 type KPIs to try and support the business. And that's where you start, right? Coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to build you a recommendation engine that helps recommend the most personalized content for every single customer. It's too far if your data is not great and you don't even understand how the business is performing. So you start there and you take the company on a journey, right? And your stakeholders on a journey.
Yeah, brilliant. And as you say, it's got to be focused on the things that matter and get people interested at the start of any journey. And if you can't get those basics right, then sometimes you lose almost the right to do anything more interesting.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely key, right? It's you say win the hearts and minds of people is what you just said. It is, and it's actually getting the permission to do the sexy stuff, right? Because once you get that credibility, you create a purpose. Everybody's bought into your purpose. You work together on working out what are the key value drivers you need to do for the business. Then you've got credibility by doing the basic stuff. That credibility then gives you the ability to go and do some of the things they want to do to help drive the business. Like, at Nike, it was things like demand forecasting and looking at demand sensing and understanding how consumers were changing behaviors. We went away and built that, where previously the business was getting externals to do it. We went and looked at the total demand forecasting, from demand to supply to inventory to eventually, selling on the shop floor. We got permission to do that because we'd done some of the basic things right. Otherwise, we never would have, right? Because they wouldn't have trusted us. I mean, you can't deliver something basic. You can't deliver the big programs.
It's credibility, isn't it? It's building trust and credibility that something's different this time, and something can change. We can do the things that are needed day to day, and then we can layer on top the real transformational stuff. I'm going to contradict myself, actually. I think we just both fell into a trap there of going, the more interesting things are kind of something over here, but that and also calling core reporting as basics. And whilst in some ways they are basics because they're the foundational things you need, they can be transformational. Just having the better visibility, better insights into what's happened recently, and then the smarts to be able to do something about it, that is transformational in its own right, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I did say, it sounds like basic reporting, but KPI trees and working out what's driving what, and actually understanding that the network, and actually was even more specific, that data being carried on the network was impacting. That's a data science piece, and you're going through regression analysis. You're trying to work out, what is the correlation between network and customer and churn and all. So it's not simple, right? But it can start out simple with a KPI tree, and then you're really going into more complex things. And in effect, where you want that basic reporting to get, and I'll put in inverted commas, is you want that basic reporting to become a simulation tool for the organization. Because if you understand the drivers, And that was somewhat what we were doing at Nike, and Nike still carrying on doing that. Is what we were doing, saying, okay, if I pull this lever and I increase the value of the product, what happens in Germany? Yeah. Or if I don't have enough, Nike tops, what else do I sell? So how can I pull those drivers and levers and simulate the sales in my market to understand how am I going to drive my business forward? So again, yeah, it becomes super important. It starts out as something basic, but it gets into something that can be quite helpful in terms of planning a business.
How do we make sure that, or how have you seen that works to make sure that the things that you do, the metrics that you focus on, or the dashboards that you build, or the models that you put in place, or the value that you try and deliver is aligned to what people know and understand and are trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think so. One is always think about what are the core values of the organization and how does the organization work, right? Because you have to understand how people tick before you can actually get them engaged. So you've got to really understand what happens in companies. And if I think of a Diageo or a Nike, even a Liberty Global, very collaborative organization. So the first thing to align on is not to say, hey, I'm the smartest person in the room. I know exactly what you need. Even if you do, right? Most times they don't, right? I understand what I've done in my space. I don't understand the new company I've gone into. I have ideas, but you need to get that collaboration going. And in companies like Nike, for example, which were super matrix companies, you have to get people on board and help them understand. So what you actually start out with, for me, is really the effort of working out what all the various pain points with stakeholders, understanding why they can't make the decisions that they want to. And I'll give an example, and I won't say who it was, but one of the guys at Nike said to me, I'm like in my late 60s. I don't understand these dashboards. I don't know how to use these things. What do I do? And that led us to actually creating the Nike Analytics Academy, so that we could actually train executives how to look at data and ask the right questions, and then right down to the more complex, because we even set up a data science academy to train those people who had the aptitude to become these data scientists, but were sitting in a slightly more easier, if you like, or less complex analytics role. And we wanted them to move into it because it was smart and they really just needed to be in that space. So it's really about educating the organization is the other bit. And then the third bit is really understanding what is the ambition of the company, where is it we want to go, and then co-creating the vision together, right? So putting these things together, that's how it's getting that engagement. It's not going off and putting an analytics strategy and say, bang, there's the strategy I presented. It's getting together with the rest of the organization and putting that together. I always tell people, analytics is the role of everybody in the organization, but it's also a team sport. And so because it's a team sport, we need to bring together the analytics experts, the business experts, the technology experts, so we can actually create this thing together. My role, or I think the role of that leader, is to glue that together, to make sure that it makes sense, so we become the glue, getting that together, making sure that it all stacks up, and then inputting and bringing our own expertise to say, well, that's going to work, that doesn't, maybe we should try this, to prompt and challenge to create the right strategy for the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I was chatting to an organization, very, very large organization, global, 100,000 plus employees kind of size. And they were asking me the question about, should they be thinking kind of top down or bottom up in the way that they defined and then executed their strategy. And my view is this kind of, I talked to them about it being like a pincer movement. You've got to have a bit of both, but what's your view on sort of aligning very tightly to the kind of business strategy versus aligning to like some kind of operational set of objectives day to day versus kind of BAU? How do you sort of approach aligning this sort of value to something within the organization?
Yeah, it's always difficult because somebody's going to be unhappy in that situation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's two elements for me on that. What is the mood of the business and what does the leadership want to do and what do they want to achieve? So you really need to look there. And in some ways, you're going to get those that are advocates and those that don't know what this stuff is and kind of take it, and then you're going to get the detractors. My first view is, it's not forget about them, but just park the detractors for a while, right? Because you cannot get to them and you're going to get stuck in an argument. So work with the advocates, work with them on creating the partnership, assess their appetite for change, understand the ambition of business, and then come up with maybe one or two things, right? Priorities always misinterpreted, right? We always talk about priorities, no such word in the English dictionary. So pick the priority that you need to tackle with that stakeholder and then show how it works, right? And invariably, those advocates, they're normally also really good at bringing the rest of the execs along. That's what I found. Maybe I've just been lucky, but they're really good at doing that because they're generally collaborative people and open-minded people. So they bring that along. So
yeah,
it's just
like, it's a bit similar to sort of influencers on social media. Find the people that can amplify the message, tell the story for you, cheerleaders.
Exactly. So you're just getting those individuals to come along with you, and then you create that buzz at that top level. The second thing for me is, when you start talking about the bottom piece, you've got to understand the buzz at the bottom. That's what I normally talk about, right? That's the reality, right? Because executives and leaders don't really know how hard it is to do the work down the bottom. And so what I always tend to do is when I get into a business is I make it a habit to talk to everyone at all levels, as many people as I can get to. And I'm not just talking about my team, right? I mean, I remember my Centrica days, I was at British Gas. I went cold calling with a field sales agent because they were the ones who complained the most about how analytics work and it wasn't useful for them. And I do remember it was in some dodgy, well, let me not mention the name. It was pretty dodgy looking area with really, it wasn't the nicest of neighborhood, but to be fair, the people we knocked on were amazing, right? And actually quite friendly. I was quite surprised. So I went knocking on doors, and supply, for example, at Nike, I went down to the distribution center, saw how the warehouse was working. I spent a day in a store selling shoes, at Diageo, unfortunately, I didn't get anywhere because we're stuck in COVID. So I met my team in India, which I got out to, but, met my own team, but didn't get out to our distilleries. So I think the important thing is to understand what is happening in all levels of the organization, and then pick out those things that align with the top level ambition. So when you talk about bringing it down, it's not about doing everything at the bottom, because a lot of it has no greater value for the business and only helps an individual. So you can coach an individual and let them go and self-help, if you like. But where you're trying to pull out is, okay, exec said this, I looked at it at the bottom level, doesn't make sense. How do we fix that component? So for example, Nike said we were really good at doing demand forecasting, as an example. Yet the guy sitting in the warehouse in the distribution center said, no, they're not, because we got stacks of boxes sitting all over the place and they're not going anywhere. And it's costing us money and reducing our space. So it was a disconnect, right?
Interesting you say that example. We had an organization I worked with, and when we did some demand forecast accuracy reporting, and when you looked at the actual accuracy at a macro level, it looked really good. It was like, yeah, we're pretty accurate with our forecast. But when you dug a bit deeper, spoke to the warehouse. You spoke to the warehouse, and it was like, yeah, we've either got too much of everything or not enough of everything all the time. But that netted out on a report as we're all right. So it was only once you started talking to the front line about what's actually happening, and then looking at the numbers. The numbers were like, well, we're like 1,000% too much on some stuff and 1,000% too low on some stuff. That's netting out at zero. So we look okay. So yeah, I think that sort of detailed look is quite important.
Yeah, and exactly, that gets into that granular element, right? I mean, an exec will just know that it looks good, but if once you get into the detail, it could be quite lopsided. And I mean, in that example, we ended up building a franchise management tool. A Nike franchise is like it's part of a category. Like, for example, if you got shoes, an Air Max is a different franchise to an Air Force to a football shoe, right? Like a Mercurial is different to a Phantom, those type of things. Those are all the various franchises. And so what we ended up seeing is trying to work out if we could optimize how the products would disperse within the various countries. And what we ended up looking at very simply is who is buying what shoe. For example, we moved shoes from Turkey to the UK because it was selling in the UK, not Turkey. And we moved others from the UK to other parts of the country, right? So it was to try and shift and optimize that sale. And then what we focused on was for the next season, focus on the right demand forecast, right? Because you can't always fix a problem that's already happened. And so, you've then got to work out what can you do at that bottom level, but that was also helping the top level, right? Because they needed to get rid of the stock and continue to drive revenue. So you drove incremental revenue by selling what was already in the warehouse, but nobody was aware of it. And so that also creates that. So I think when you're saying, how do you bring those two together, you've got to find the common denominator between the two. The execs give you the ambition and vision. The people on the ground give you the problems
really
and the detail. And you've got to pick on those ones and knit those together. And then I think the third thing for me always is then don't also just get caught up in what everybody knows. but work out what do you know, what have you seen in the market as an analytics leader, and where do you think the organization should be going? That bit motivates your team as well, because they get excited about the future, right, and what they're able to do. So you always need to find that time and space where you can play and innovate and drive some of those elements forward. And again, an example for me was way back in Centrica days with NPS, where we started to use NPS to help the CEO talk to the press using the insights we got from the Net Promoter Score survey, right? That had never been done before. But we said to him, here's the mood of your customer. This is the mood of your good customer. This is the mood of your bad customer. Maybe this is how you need to alter the language, and you need to look through it, and you need to change the way you talked. And that actually influenced the way he spoke, right? Not because he was changing his rhetoric, he was just changing his language to accommodate the people and, the customers in the organization, which was really positive for the company, actually.
Two things really stand out for me, Carlos, here, and it's inspiring to talk to you, because I think this kind of angle and context of being a data leader, actually being a business leader who cares about data as well, is this idea that this is about business stuff. This is about solving problems, delivering your objectives, helping customers. That's what it's about. But also the other side is, and that's where the sort of value charge bit comes from. The other side is that you talk there, particularly that NPS example, almost about being a kind of strategic advisor as a data guy, being a strategic advisor to other parts of the organization to say, we should look here, this is what we spotted, you might want to use this in this way. Is that an approach that you've honed, or is that kind of, you've just had a very welcoming sort of set of peers that will sort of want to listen and need to listen indeed? How's that sort of come about in terms of that kind of being that internal advisor?
So one is, I come from a marketing background, right? I don't come from a pure data background. I started out doing marcom, so I was quite used to already working with the organization. I think also for me, my brain works on a commercial element, right? I don't believe that we do data for data's sake, as you don't either, right? It is about making it, it must matter. It must change the business. It must drive the organization. Super important for us to do that. So that already starts in creating that relationship with your peers and with the functional leaders, because they already go, he's not talking data, he's talking business.
Well, we're 20 minutes into a podcast, essentially a data podcast, without mentioning the word, and that's the point, isn't it? That's what this is about. It's what it's about.
Absolutely, and that's how business runs around, right? It runs around the how do we make decisions, and I think when you said have I had easy stakeholders and has it been simple? I wish it had been. And I see you smirking now. I wish it had been. There have been, I think what I have been lucky with is, in every organization, there has always been advocates, which is going to be, and my boss has generally been that advocate, right? And it's always helped. And I've always had a leader that I report into who's influential in that organization, right? Some great leaders. And that's very helpful. And then the other thing I think for me is, the way to change the attitude of the business and become that trusted partner is to actually deliver what you say, right? Words are worth nothing until you prove the facts, right? So you've got to do that. And for me, I always talk about co-creation, co-development, co-deployment. So important, right? Everything is about partnership. I'm not going to go and build a report for you. I want you to tell me, what are the questions? What are you trying to ask? Don't tell me you want sales by this. I don't understand that. I don't understand sales by channel. What are you going to do with it? And I'll give you an example. You ask that why. So you get people moving. I had somebody at Nike ask me, can you give me a sales report for London? I want to see how many sales I'm doing. And I said to him, well, why do you want the sales report for London? Well, I want the sales report because I have too much stock and I want to know how I distribute that in London. I said, great. Why do you have too much stock in London? And he went, well, I have too much stock in London because the DC in Lockdown in Belgium tells me that there's a whole bunch of stock allocated to me and they just keep shipping it. And I said, well, why do you have too much stock in the distribution center? Demand forecast was wrong. See, we're back to the same problem. So that caused the problem. Now you're asking me for a report. I'll give you the report, but what you really need is to improve the demand forecast for London. So let's go and understand the opportunity in London, the market in London, the customer in London, what they buy in London. So let's do a demand sensing piece of work to forecast correctly, to get you the right product so that next season, your sales report looks quite nice because you're selling everything you've got. That's what you want to get to. So that's part of that trusted partnership, is actually digging down and working with them on what's the problem. And that's why when I talk about Nike and Liberty Global a lot, we did a lot of that educational piece, and we ran the academies. And that was important because I remember running the first analytics session with the test pilot executives or leaders, senior leaders. And one of the guys said to me, how do I ask an analytical question? I said, there's no such thing. Just ask a business question. My job is to figure out how to turn that analytical question into a mathematical problem and an analytics problem. And then when we come back to you, by the way, it's going to be really super simple, because we'll just tell you what the action is and we'll work together with you whether it's feasible or not. Then we go and tweak the models, then we come back and it becomes that collaborative piece. So I think I've always been very lucky that the companies I've worked in are quite collaborative. And where there have been, sorry, Jason, where there have been detractors, actually they've left the organization, which you might say is lucky after a bit of time because they've seen the change coming, or they've gotten on board. And sometimes it's been a bit difficult, but they've gotten on board. And a lot of it has been, let's just work out what's your problem. How do we help you? Some of them I've helped coach, right? And teach them what data was about. And they went from detractors to advocates, right?
Yeah. What about the other way? So that's kind of, I guess, your peers and up and down. What about like within the team? So it's not normal or common, I should say. It's not common to see a data function operate and think in the way that you're articulating. And particularly if they're sort of from a more of a sort of traditional background and sort of come from like an IT thing and then a data thing. How do you go about ensuring that you've got a team that can, I suppose, deliver on this promise? Because it's quite a high, you're sort of setting quite a high bar with the way you're talking there, certainly versus how I see many organizations kind of going about things and the type of conversations that are had focusing on sort of capabilities and governance and platforms and people. So is there a different type of team you need, a different type of structure, a different type of approach to your sort of data team, if I can put them in a box, or is this really just about changing the narrative and bringing the organization along with you?
Well, I think in every organization I've gone in, I think that's an amazing question, right, to ask, because as we just said, is the team is what helps you succeed or fail, right? And every organization I've gone into, there's some work to be done. And I think I've always found there's two areas that the team come from. They come from more of a business world and are awesome at spreadsheets and old school, like a lot of people got consolidated doing reporting and they're trying to learn, but they have really good business acumen. They understand how the business works and the analytics is okay. Some of them can do a little bit of dashboarding and stuff like that. And then you get those who come from technology, some of them data scientists, and some just platform people. So you've got this mix. It's like being in the United Nations, right? Everybody comes from all these different avenues and how they've come into the team. And so again, for me, it really starts with what you do with the organization, right? You get to talk to the team members. I mean, I arrived at Diageo. The first thing I did, I think I was there for 3 weeks. I got on a plane and went to India because half my team was in India. So I went to India and I talked to everybody, literally everybody I could talk to, some of them one-on-one, trying to understand what they did. Where did they come from? How did they think? What were they looking at? They wanted to do a panel with me to ask me questions. And I said, that's fine, I'll do that. But then I want one leader from every team and I'm going to ask you questions. So we understand how you guys work. And so we went through that whole, what did people do? How did they do it? So I think that's one. I think the second thing for me is another question I come in. So I'm getting that sense of the organization, right, and the team. The second bit is, I think I've asked my data science teams this for, like 15 years, or, call them advanced analytics. In those days, they weren't called data scientists, but, like your modelers and that type of thing. So I always ask them the question, how many times have you failed in the past year? And they go, we don't fail. We get everything right. We do everything we need. I said, great. So we're going to have to go and create a space for you guys to fail so that we can innovate and so we can think outside of the box. And they all look at me and go, what do you mean? We don't do that in this company. Yeah. And so I think that's the second thing for me as you're building out those teams is get the team to feel confident in you that you're okay when they fail. You're okay if they play a little bit, and we'll set some time aside for that. So that gets that motivation, because you know what analysts are like. They want to do some cool things. And yes, of course they want to play, and they don't have the time. So what we end up saying is, guys, we're going to prioritize. We're going to focus on that, and then we're going to give you some playtime.
Yeah.
So that's your motivational piece. And I think for me, that important piece, and I always quote Nelson Mandela, so everybody knows me, it's I never lose, I either win or I learn. Okay. And so that failure is a learning opportunity that we take, right? Yeah. But we've got to create that. We can't win all the time. Yeah. I mean, you should know your English rugby never wins, right? Sorry, I had to get that one in and say two bucks are better. But you know what I mean, right? So you've got to give them that opportunity to do that. And so you've got to build the morale by doing that. And then there's the element of training our people. And I've talked about the academies, right? Understanding what their skills are. It's not about getting people out of the organization. It's about upskilling. And part of that training is agile training. Right. So one of the things I always do with my teams is put them into squads. So for example, you'll have a reporting squad, and in Diageo, my reporting squad, the product manager came from a function, from the business, from the commercial business. There was visualization people who came from an IT background. There was designers who came from more of a UX background. There was data engineers who were pure IT. So they're a mixed bunch of people with different skills. Data scientists who had sat more on the marketing side, and you form those squads. So you start to teach them to work together. And how do they make that work? So you got to break down the silos within the team to create that. So you do a different way of working, and it's painful, by the way. You can ask the team right now. I mean, like I was talking to one of them a couple of days ago. They say, we're finally, all the teams are getting it. It's not just our pilot teams. People are starting to get it, how to work in those squads. So you've got to build that community and those processes to allow the team to work in a much better way. And then one thing I always do with my leaders is say, hey, do you feel comfortable with what you're doing? No, I don't. I've got this, or I understand this, or I feel comfortable. They'll tell you where they're at, because I don't know why, but I'm quite good at getting the good and the bad out of the team. Maybe it's just I'm a relaxed individual and they feel comfortable, but quite good at getting that information out. And then I'll go, well, hang on a second. I know somebody externally who could really help you. They can just, partner up with you. So I try and find them. Somebody's doing a similar role, maybe a little bit more experience, to help guide them. And so try and create those partnerships with them outside of the company. So they get a bit of complaint space, if you like, so they can talk to someone else, but also knowledge space about what else is happening out there. So for me, that's kind of the way to build those teams is, if I go back to and summarize that, is assess where they're at and their abilities, and then find ways to fill those gaps, either through educational academies or training, or external mentorship. And then the second thing is put the right processes, almost force them to work together, so that they can draw from each other and grow. And the third and most important one, allow them to fail every now and then. It's good for them. It's good for their morale. And it's amazing for the company, because we will do something that actually drives change, right? That will actually make a difference in the organization. And I can say without fault, that has happened every time I've worked in a company. We've driven something that we never expected to do.
Amazing. Great. No, that's really, really interesting approach. And I guess just sort of thinking about wrapping up across, you've worked with some really exciting brands, lots of different industries as well, very consumer facing, business to business, telco, all sorts. And have you got sort of what's the best example of a piece of value that's been delivered, not necessarily even the size of the value in terms of return, but just the most interesting, exciting piece that you're most proud of in terms of delivering value back to the organization?
I mean, the most interesting one, where I always it always goes back, maybe because it was one of the first ones we did that I really thought would fundamentally change the way an entire sector worked, right, was back in Vodafone days. And it sounds like quite a long time ago, but it was the one that sticks in my head. We went off and did a proactive piece of work based on what people were asking. So we're about to launch the iPhone, which we'd missed the game on in the UK. O2 had the sole distribution rights, and then we got given it. And we wanted to know how smartphones would operate. We were hearing these questions, right? I remember Jenny Mundy, who was our chief technology officer, thinking about what's this going to do to my network. And commercial was talking about, how do we sell more of this stuff? This stuff is big, iPhone had failed all the telephone tests, but was sold because of being an amazing, app store. And so I remember all these questions of business, and I went back to the team and I said, guys, have we ever done any piece of analysis to understand the impact of a smartphone on our industry? And we're talking about being the home of the smartphone. I don't think we've ever done anything. Do we understand how consumers will consume it? Do we understand what we need to do for them? Do we understand how our infrastructure will cope? And so the team came up with, I think it was 6 or 7 questions, if I remember correctly, and said, let's go and look through these and let's explore it. By the way, they explored it when we had our space and time to do it at work, but some of them did it at home. I remember getting phone calls on Saturdays and going, hey, I'm working on this and I've looked at this problem. What do you think? And we'd be sitting chatting. So it was weird, right? I wouldn't subscribe that everybody does that. You know, you need your work-life balance, but it was just something we were exciting about it. And when it came back, and what we did, we answered 3 key questions, or we initiated 3 key things to business. And this is the important piece, the value that came out of it. Number 1 is we invested 50 million less in the network over the next 12 months. Okay. And I remember Jenny saying to me, how can that be? And we showed her, we had hotspots. You know, the culmination of the analysis was a beautiful hotspot map that showed churn, the greater the network, and the potential value of customers. And what you could see is, where should you invest? For example, Canary Wharf had 2G. How on earth was a smartphone going to work there? It wasn't, right? And so it was just about tweaking the masts and upgrading the network. So we looked at where should you upgrade and where it wasn't really important. And when you looked at it, instead of this blanket thing we used to do every time, you were going to save about 50 million. So that was great. And I remember Jenny saying to me, what can I do for your team? This is fantastic, right? This is really going to drive change. What can I do for them? You know, how can we give them a weekend away or something? There's 3 of them. And you know what they asked for? More powerful laptops to do better analysis. That's what they asked for, not a weekend away. So that's what they ended up getting, which I always thought, come on, guys, you're for a weekend away. What do you want laptops for? The second thing that made me super proud of it is what we realized that the traffic on the network, we predicted that data would overtake voice and text, which was what it was, right? Yeah. And we had very little data. And O2, I talked to the O2 guys, they didn't know when that was going to happen. We thought we'd predicted really well. We built some good models. We were really confident what we had. And we said within 9 months, it was going to overtake us launching the iPhone. And this is what we think. And obviously, we had Verizon. We were part of Verizon Verizon was part of us in the US, so we could see what was happening in the US. And we did that. And I remember Guy Lawrence, the CEO, saying to me, are you sure? I said, yes, I'm sure. Are you willing to bet your bonus? I said, maybe not, but I'm quite sure. I'm quite sure that we're going to overtake it. And so we looked at it and we said, okay, it's going to overtake it. So what we ended up doing as a business is flipping the price plans. So price plans until then and all telcos have been on voice and text. And we went early and tied them into data, and the whole industry followed. It's gone that way. 6 months later, right? They all ended up following what we did. So that actually changed the way the business worked. And if you looked at it, the value initially wasn't great, but when it started to change, we were the ones who benefited the most. Yeah. And the final thing that came out of that analysis was the VIP loyalty program. And we did some clever things like at Glastonbury. We said, hey, at Glastonbury, it's great we give them tickets to go to Glastonbury, but we need a truck with some batteries in it so we can charge the phones. Because what happens when you go to Glastonbury? You run out of charge. Yeah. So what we ended up doing is getting these trucks in, and the O2 customer would come and go, sorry, you're not special enough. This is only for Vodafone customers. And so we got a whole bunch of people at Glastonbury and these kind of events coming over to us because we were offering these batteries so people could charge their iPhones. Anyway, I was super proud of that because I think it was a great team effort. We collaborated really well with the business. We had great advocates in the business. We even had a detractor when, if this is what you can do, when nobody's asking you anything, imagine what we can do when we all put our minds together. Yeah. So it was a really positive thing. And I think it really drove that change at Vodafone. That was quite evident.
I love the example purely on the fact that it just cuts across everything we've talked about, and particularly kind of how close to the action you talk in terms of the business. You know, you're talking about data driving what happens at festivals and where masks are built. You know, this is what data's about. So look, I've loved our chat. I've loved this so much. I think this is brilliant. I think you've had some amazing experience. I've loved hearing about it. I'm sure everyone listening will as well. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. And I hope you've enjoyed talking about it as much as I have listening to it.
It's been brilliant, Jason. Really, thank you for inviting me. I think it's amazing, and it's always exciting to talk about what do we do and how can we drive change. So thank you very much for inviting me.
No problem. And thanks everyone for listening. We hope you come back soon and listen to more. Thanks a lot.